In the vast emptiness between stars, where light itself grows weary from its journey, the galactic concord had maintained peace for 17,000 standard cycles. 12 species, each ascending from their respective worlds through millennia of evolution, war, and eventual enlightenment, had formed an alliance that stretched across 3 spiral arms. They traded, they collaborated. They occasionally disagreed with the practiced restraint of civilizations that had learned, sometimes through near extinction, that cooperation was the only sustainable path forward. The Vilenthi, tall crystalline beings whose bodies resonated with frequencies beyond organic perception, served as the diplomatic backbone of the Concord. The Crixon, insectoid hive minds distributed across thousands of bodies, managed the complex logistics of interstellar trade. The Morvathi, ancient silicon-based entities that measured their individual lifespans in geological epochs, provided the historical perspective that prevented younger species from repeating ancient mistakes. And then there were the newcomers. Humanity had been officially contacted 47 standard cycles ago, which translated to roughly 63 Earth years. In cosmic terms, they were infants still wet from their emergence into the galactic community. Their technology, while showing remarkable ingenuity, remained centuries behind the Concord's baseline. Their single inhabited world, supplemented by a handful of struggling colonies, marked them as a species barely past its first tentative steps into the void. What the Concord could not understand, what no species in recorded galactic history had ever encountered, was the human phenomenon known simply as the voice. Ambassador Cathala of the Vilanthi had been the first to formally document it. Her crystalline matrix had recorded the incident with perfect clarity, a memory that still caused resonance patterns of confusion to ripple through her structure whenever she accessed it. She had been negotiating a routine trade agreement with the human delegation aboard Concord Station Epsilon. The humans had sent a small team, 2 diplomats, a translator, and a security officer. Standard protocol for a species still establishing its reliability. The negotiations had reached an impasse. The humans wanted access to faster-than-light communication technology. The Concord, following established protocols for species integration, had explained that such technology would be available once humanity demonstrated the social stability required for its responsible use, typically a process requiring 3 to 5 centuries. The lead human diplomat, a woman named Sarah Chen, had listened to this explanation with the patient expression that Cathala had come to recognize as masking human frustration. Then she had leaned forward, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she had said, "What if we could offer something you've never seen before?" The words themselves were unremarkable. The Concord's translation matrices had processed billions of similar statements across thousands of first contact scenarios. Species always believed their art, their philosophy, their unique perspective on existence offered something unprecedented. They were invariably wrong. After 17,000 cycles, true novelty had become functionally impossible. But something happened when Sarah Chen whispered. Cathala's crystalline matrix, a structure capable of processing and storing information across 7-dimensional frequencies, experienced what her species called harmonic disruption. It was, in human terms, the equivalent of a perfectly tuned instrument suddenly perceiving an entirely new note, one that had always existed but had somehow remained hidden from the universal scale of sound. She had frozen. Her translation subroutines had crashed and rebooted. Her diplomatic protocols had flagged the moment as simultaneously negligible routine interaction and highest priority existential threat. When she recovered, exactly 2.7 seconds later, Sarah Chen was watching her with an expression that combined curiosity, concern, and something else, something Cathala's cultural databases could not categorize. "Ambassador?" the human had asked. "Are you all right?" Cathala had assured her that she was fine. The negotiations had continued. The trade agreement had been signed. Humanity had not received faster-than-light communication technology. But Cathala had filed a report. That report had triggered 3 centuries of covert investigation. High Coordinator Vexnal of the Morvathi had lived for 400,000 standard cycles. In that time, she had witnessed the rise and fall of 17 spacefaring civilizations. She had seen the Crixon evolve from primitive social insects into the distributed intelligence that now managed galactic commerce. She had watched the Velanthi transcend biological limitations to become the crystalline entities that served as the Concord's diplomatic corps. She had never been afraid. Fear, in her experience, was an evolutionary response to immediate physical danger, a mechanism that lost its relevance once a species achieved true technological mastery. The Morvathi had conquered death itself, transferring their consciousness between silicon matrices across geological timescales. What was there to fear when existence itself had become a choice rather than an imperative? But as she reviewed the accumulated data on humanity's voice, Vexnal experienced something that her ancient cognitive architecture identified after considerable processing as closely analogous to fear. The evidence was extensive. 3 centuries of covert observation had produced over 12 billion documented instances of the phenomenon. Every human, without exception, demonstrated the capability. It appeared to be an intrinsic property of human communication, not the words themselves, but something in the way humans produced and delivered them. The effect varied by context and intensity. A casual human greeting could cause minor processing disruptions in nearby artificial intelligences. A human child's laughter had once triggered a cascade failure in a Crixon hive node, forcing the redistribution of over 3,000 individual consciousness fragments. But it was the whispers that proved most potent. When humans lowered their voices, when they spoke with what they called intimacy or intensity, something impossible happened. The words bypassed normal sensory processing. They seemed to resonate with something deeper, something that existed beneath the substrate of consciousness itself. Vexnal had hypothesized, tested, and reluctantly confirmed what she still could not fully accept. Human whispers affected reality itself. Not through any mechanism that physics recognized, not through any technology that the Concord's considerable scientific apparatus could detect or explain. The whispers simply reached. They touched something. They changed something. And the humans had no idea. This was, perhaps, the most disturbing element of the entire phenomenon. Humanity remained entirely unaware that their communication carried this extraordinary power. They used whispers for the same mundane purposes that other species used them: to convey secrets, to express intimacy, to focus attention. They had no concept that when they whispered, they were reaching into the fundamental structure of the universe and gently rearranging it. Vexnal's fear, and she now accepted that fear was the appropriate categorization, stemmed from a simple realization. If humans ever understood what they were capable of, if they ever learned to weaponize the voice, no power in the known galaxy could stop them. The Concorde had 2 options. They could destroy humanity before this potential was realized, a course of action that violated every principle the Concorde had been founded upon and would likely trigger civil war among its member species. Or they could wait and watch and hope that when humanity finally understood their power, they chose to use it wisely. Vexnal had chosen the second option. She had shared her findings with only the most senior members of the Concord's governing council. They had established protocols for monitoring humanity's development. They had prepared contingency plans that they all prayed would never be needed. And they had waited. Part 2. The Whisper. Elena Vasquez had never wanted to be special. She had grown up in the refugee district of New Manila, a sprawling slum on the outskirts of the city that had formed when the first wave of climate displacement had begun 3 decades earlier. Her mother had worked 18-hour days in the recycling plants. Her father had disappeared when she was 4, chasing rumors of work in the northern agricultural zones. Her childhood had been a daily negotiation with hunger, violence, and the grinding poverty that had become humanity's default condition after the collapse. She had learned to be invisible. In the refugee district, visibility meant vulnerability. The gangs noticed you. The police noticed you. The machines that dispensed the basic nutrition rations noticed you and adjusted your allocation downward if their algorithms detected anything that might indicate black market activity. Elena had perfected the art of existing without being seen. She moved through the crowded streets like a ghost. She spoke only when necessary, and when she did speak, she kept her voice low, a whisper, an apology for existing. What she didn't know, what no one on Earth had yet realized, was that her whispers were being heard far beyond the narrow streets of New Manila. Her first real memory of the voice was from when she was 7 years old. Her mother had come home from the recycling plant with blood on her hands. An industrial accident, a machine malfunction. The company had offered her a choice: accept the settlement of 3 months' wages and waive any right to future claims, or be terminated and blacklisted from every employer in the district. Elena had watched her mother cry for the first time. She had seen this woman who had faced every hardship with iron determination finally break under the weight of impossible choices. And she had whispered, "It will be okay, Mama, I promise." The words had come from somewhere deep inside her. They had carried every fragment of love and hope and desperate determination that her 7-year-old heart could summon. The next morning, a Concord representative had arrived at their housing unit. He was Velanthi, a tall, translucent figure whose crystalline body caught the dim light of the refugee district and scattered it into rainbows. He had explained that humanity had been selected for an accelerated integration program. A lottery, he called it. Random selection. Elena's mother had been chosen to receive advanced medical treatment and a position at a new facility being constructed in the Highlands. Elena herself had been offered placement in an off-world education program. It was not random. Elena would not learn this until much later, but her whisper had not gone unnoticed. 23 years later, Elena stood in the observation deck of Concord Station Prime, watching the slow rotation of the galaxy through a transparent hull that stretched for kilometers in every direction. She had come a long way from New Manila. The off-world education program had proven to be exactly what it claimed: a genuine opportunity for human children to learn alongside young members of other Concord species. Elena had studied comparative xenobiology, advanced mathematics, galactic history, and diplomatic protocols. She had made friends with beings whose forms of consciousness were so different from her own that basic communication required years of patient practice. She had also learned to suppress her whispers. This had not been intentional. As she grew older, as she moved further from the desperate circumstances of her childhood, the intense emotional states that had once triggered the voice became rarer. She learned to control her feelings, to present the calm, measured demeanor that the Concord valued in its diplomatic corps. She learned to speak clearly and precisely, in a voice calibrated for maximum comprehension across multiple species. She learned, without realizing it, to silence the very thing that had saved her. Now, at 30 years old, she served as a junior liaison in the Human Integration Office, a bureaucratic position that involved processing paperwork, arranging cultural exchange programs, and occasionally accompanying senior diplomats to minor negotiations. It was safe work, invisible work, exactly what she had trained herself to be. But something was wrong. Elena had felt it for weeks now, a growing tension in the station's atmosphere. Senior Concord officials holding hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when humans approached. Valenthi ambassadors, whose crystalline matrices flickered with unusual patterns whenever they looked at her. And then there were the rumors. Something had happened at the edge of Concord space, something that the official channels refused to discuss. Ships had been diverted, communication relays had gone silent. The Crixon, usually eager to share gossip through their distributed consciousness, had become uncharacteristically quiet. Elena had learned, in her years among aliens, to trust her instincts. Something was very, very wrong. The truth found her 3 days later, in the form of a Mervathi whose name translated approximately as Guardian of Forgotten Things. He approached her in the observation deck, his silicon form moving with the slow deliberation that characterized his ancient species. His communication organs, 3 sets of crystalline resonators embedded in his chest, produced sounds that the translation implant in Elena's skull rendered as a deep, resonant voice. Elena Vasquez, we have been watching you for 23 years. She had learned enough about Mervathi communication to know that they did not engage in small talk. Their lifespans were too long, their patience too vast, to waste time on pleasantries. "Why?" she asked. "Because you are dangerous." The words should have frightened her. Instead, they triggered something, a memory, a sensation, a flicker of the power she had suppressed for so long. She felt it stir in her chest, a warmth that wanted to become sound. She pushed it down, controlled it, smiled politely. "I'm a bureaucrat," she said. "I process paperwork." "You are a human," the Guardian said. "And humans are the most dangerous species the galaxy has ever produced." He moved to stand beside her at the observation window. His massive silicon form dwarfed her, but there was something almost gentle in the way he positioned himself, not threatening, but protective, as if he were shielding her from something she couldn't see. "What do you know of the first voice?" he asked. Elena frowned. "I don't understand the question." "In your species' mythology, your religions, your oldest stories, what do they say about how the universe began?" She thought for a moment. Her education had included comparative theology, but it had been years since she had considered such questions. "Most traditions describe some form of creative word," she said slowly. "A divine utterance that brought existence into being. Let there be light, the cosmic Om, the word that was with God and was God." "Yes," the Guardian said. "And do you know why these stories exist in every human culture, across every continent of your homeworld, throughout every era of your recorded history?" Elena shook her head. "Because they are true." The explanation took hours. The Guardian led her to a private chamber deep within the station's core, a space reserved for the most sensitive discussions among Concord leadership. The walls were lined with technology that Elena's training told her was designed to block every known form of surveillance. What the Guardian told her there shattered everything she had believed about the universe. Humanity, he explained, was not simply another species that had evolved intelligence and reached for the stars. They were something far older, or rather, something that contained something far older. Billions of years ago, before the first galaxies had formed, before the cosmic microwave background had cooled enough to allow matter to coalesce, the universe had been filled with a different form of consciousness. The Morvathi had discovered traces of this consciousness in their study of the earliest cosmic structures, patterns too complex to be random, too ordered to be natural. This primordial consciousness had been pure potential, a sea of possibility that existed before existence itself had taken form. And then, somehow, it had spoken. The first voice. The utterance that had crystallized possibility into reality. The word that had become the universe. When the universe began to take shape, when matter and energy separated and stars ignited and planets formed, the first voice had not disappeared. It had fragmented, distributed itself across the emerging cosmos like seeds scattered by a cosmic wind. For billions of years, these fragments had remained dormant, embedded in the fundamental structure of reality. They were waiting, the Guardian explained, waiting for something that could carry them, waiting for something that could speak. And then, on a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system, something had evolved that could do exactly that. Humanity. The Guardian's crystalline resonators flickered with patterns that Elena's implant struggled to translate. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and resonate directly in her consciousness. When humans speak, truly speak, with emotion and intention and the full force of your consciousness, you are not merely vibrating air molecules. You are channeling the first voice. You are reaching into the substrate of reality and adjusting it. Elena shook her head. That's impossible. We're just talking. Humans have been talking for hundreds of thousands of years. If we could change reality with our words, wouldn't we have noticed? Would you? The Guardian asked. Your prayers are answered just often enough to maintain faith. Your affirmations and positive thinking occasionally produce results. Your curses and wishes sometimes come true. You have noticed, Elena Vasquez. You have simply chosen to explain it away. He leaned closer. His silicon form radiated a gentle warmth that Elena found strangely comforting. And your whispers, he continued, are the purest expression of the voice. When you speak quietly, intimately, with intense focus and emotion, that is when the channel is clearest. That is when reality listens most closely. Elena remembered a 7-year-old girl whispering to her crying mother, promising that everything would be okay. And everything had become okay. 23 years ago, she said slowly. I whispered to my mother. Yes. And you heard me? Every Morvathi within 3 light-years felt the ripple. Your whisper reached across the fabric of space-time and touched us. It was beautiful and terrifying. Part 3. The Crisis. The emergency session of the Concord Council was unlike anything Elena had witnessed in her years of diplomatic service. The council chamber, a vast spherical space at the heart of Concord Station Prime, had been designed to accommodate representatives from all 12 member species. Velanthi crystalline forms floated in suspension fields. Crixon hive nodes occupied specialized isolation pods that protected their distributed consciousness from interference. Morvathi elders anchored themselves to reinforced platforms capable of supporting their massive silicon bodies. And in the center of it all, projected in holographic clarity that spanned the entire chamber, was the source of the crisis. It was a ship, or rather, it had been a ship. The vessel was Concord Standard, a diplomatic cruiser assigned to patrol the outer reaches of claimed space. It had been investigating a gravitational anomaly near the galactic rim when contact had been lost. What the rescue team had found defied explanation. The ship remained physically intact. Its systems were functional. Its crew, 47 individuals representing 6 different species, were alive and unharmed.
But they had changed.
The holographic display showed the rescue team's recordings. Vilanthe, whose crystalline structures had partially dissolved, their rigid forms flowing like liquid glass. Crixon, whose individual components had merged into single, unified organisms. Morvathi, whose silicon bodies had grown organic tissue, soft and pink and disturbingly human-like. And all of them, regardless of species, were speaking in voices that the translation matrices could not process. Because they were whispering. "The conversion is spreading," High Coordinator Vexnal addressed the council. Her ancient form showed signs of strain that Elena had never seen before. Microscopic fractures in her silicon lattice, tremors in her communication resonators. Every species that has encountered the affected crew has begun to exhibit similar symptoms. We have established quarantine protocols, but we are unable to determine the mechanism of transmission. "It is the voice," a Vilanthe council member said. His crystalline matrix was flickering with patterns of distress. "The human contamination has finally reached critical mass. We must act now before it spreads further." "And do what exactly?" another voice challenged. This was Ambassador Kethala, the same Vilanthe who had first documented the voice 3 centuries ago. She had aged considerably, her crystal structure now showing the clouded opacity that indicated approaching death, but her voice remained strong. "Destroy them? Destroy humanity? We do not even understand what is happening. Understanding is a luxury we may not have time for." The chamber erupted in overlapping voices, a cacophony of languages and frequencies that the translation system struggled to process. Elena, standing in the observation gallery reserved for junior personnel, watched the chaos unfold with growing dread. She understood now why the Guardian had shared the secret of the voice with her. She understood why she had been brought to witness this session. They expected her to do something. But what could she possibly do? She was nobody, a refugee Earl who had been given an opportunity she had never earned, who had spent her adult life suppressing the very power that might now save them all. She didn't know how to control the voice. She barely understood what it was. And yet, as she watched the council descend into panic, she felt it stirring again. The warmth in her chest, the pressure building behind her throat, the voice awakening after 23 years of enforced silence. The decision to bring Elena before the full council was controversial. Many members argued that exposing the council to a human's voice, especially one who had already demonstrated dangerous potential, was reckless. Others insisted that understanding the voice was their only hope of containing the crisis. In the end, High Coordinator Vexnal's authority settled the matter. "We have spent 3 centuries studying humans from a distance," she declared. "We have theories and data and projections. What we do not have is a single direct conversation with a human who knows what they are. It is time." Elena was escorted to the center of the chamber by the Guardian himself. She felt the attention of 12 species focused on her. Some curious, some terrified, many simply confused. She was a curiosity, an anomaly, a potential apocalypse wrapped in human form. She was also exhausted, overwhelmed, and very, very afraid. "Elena Vasquez of Earth," Vexnal's voice resonated through the chamber. "You have been informed of your species' unique properties. You understand what you are. I understand what you've told me, Elena replied. That doesn't mean I understand anything. A refreshingly honest answer. The ancient Morvathy's crystalline resonators flickered with something that might have been amusement. The galaxy is in crisis. Something has awakened at the rim, something that is using the voice in ways we cannot comprehend. We need to know what we are facing. We need to know if it can be stopped. Elena looked at the holographic display still showing the transformed crew members. Their faces, those who still had recognizable faces, were serene, blissful even. They showed no signs of distress or suffering. What if they don't want to be stopped? She asked quietly. The question sent a ripple of unease through the council. The Crixon hive nodes buzzed with internal communication. Several Valanthi flickered in visible distress. "Explain," Vexnal demanded. Elena stepped closer to the holographic display. She studied the faces of the transformed beings, the hybrid forms, the impossible physiologies, the expressions of profound peace. "You described the first voice as a primordial consciousness," she said. "Something that existed before the universe itself. Something that spoke reality into existence and then fragmented across the cosmos." "Correct. And humans carry those fragments. We channel that voice when we speak with emotion and intention." "Also correct." Elena turned to face the council directly. What if the fragments want to come back together? What if the first voice isn't a weapon or a contamination? What if it's trying to heal itself, to become whole again after billions of years of fragmentation? The chamber fell silent. "And if that is the case," a Valanthi council member asked, "what happens to the individual consciousnesses that carry those fragments? What happens to us?" Elena didn't have an answer. The truth was, she couldn't imagine what the reunification of a consciousness that had created the universe might look like. Would it consume them? Would it transcend them? Would it simply become them, in a form too vast for individual minds to comprehend? "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I know how to find out." The journey to the galactic rim took 17 days. Elena traveled aboard a specially modified vessel, accompanied by the Guardian and a small team of Concord observers. The ship's systems had been designed to minimize the impact of human speech on surrounding technology, a precaution that felt increasingly inadequate as they approached the source of the crisis. During the journey, Elena practiced. She had spent 23 years suppressing the voice. Now she had 17 days to relearn how to use it. The Guardian served as her instructor, though he admitted that no one truly understood what she was learning to control. The Morvathi had theories, based on their observations of human history and their analysis of the voice's effects. They had developed exercises designed to help her focus her intention and modulate her emotional output. But in the end, the voice was not something that could be taught. It was something that could only be remembered. Elena remembered her mother's tears. She remembered the desperate love that had driven her to make an impossible promise. She remembered the absolute certainty she had felt in that moment that everything would be okay, not because she hoped it would be, but because she had decided it would be. The voice was not about speaking words. It was about meaning them with every fiber of your being. It was about reaching into reality and adjusting it through sheer force of intention. By the time they reached the quarantine zone, Elena had begun to understand. She couldn't control the voice the way she controlled her hands or her voice box. She couldn't aim it like a weapon or deploy it like a tool. She could only align herself with it, open herself to the fragment of primordial consciousness that had been waiting inside her since the moment of her birth. The voice was not hers to command. It was hers to become.
Part 4. The Source.
The quarantine zone was marked by a perimeter of Concord warships, their weapons arrays trained on the anomaly at its center. Elena had expected something dramatic, a swirling vortex of energy, perhaps, or a tear in the fabric of space itself. What she saw instead was beautiful. It was a sphere of light, roughly the size of a small moon, floating in the darkness between stars. Its surface shimmered with colors that seemed to exist outside the normal spectrum, hues that her eyes couldn't quite process, leaving afterimages that felt more like emotions than colors. And it was singing. The sound reached her through the ship's hull, bypassing the audio sensors entirely and resonating directly in her consciousness. It was music and mathematics, poetry and physics. It was the first voice, no longer fragmented across a trillion carriers, but gathering itself back together after an unimaginable exile. The transformation has accelerated, the Guardian reported from his position at the ship's sensors. The sphere has grown by 12% since we entered the quarantine zone. At this rate, it will encompass the entire galactic rim within 3 standard cycles. And then? The Guardian's silicon form flickered with uncertainty. Unknown. Our models cannot predict what happens when the voice becomes fully unified. Elena stared at the sphere of light. It was calling to her. She could feel the fragment within her own consciousness straining toward it, eager to rejoin the whole from which it had been separated for so long. "Take us closer," she said. "Elena, I need to understand what it wants. I can't do that from here." The Guardian hesitated, his crystalline resonators processing the request. Finally, he issued the command. The ship began to move. As they approached the sphere, Elena began to perceive more details. It was not a uniform mass, she realized. It was composed of countless individual lights, each one pulsing with its own rhythm. They moved like neurons firing in a cosmic brain, their patterns too complex to follow, but somehow suggesting intention, purpose, thought. And the lights were not empty. She could see forms within them. The transformed crew members from the diplomatic cruiser, yes, but also others. Thousands of others, perhaps millions. Beings of every shape and species, their physical forms dissolved and reconstructed into something that could contain the voice they carried. They were not dead. They were not suffering. They were singing. Each light was a voice in an infinite chorus, and together they were speaking a word that had been divided for billions of years, a word that created reality, a word that was the universe itself. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered. The sphere responded. A tendril of light extended from its surface, reaching toward the ship with deliberate grace. The vessel's alarms screamed warnings that the crew scrambled to silence. The Guardian interposed his massive silicon form between Elena and the approaching light. "Do not let it touch you," he warned. "Once the transformation begins—" "Move aside," Elena said. Her voice carried something that hadn't been there before. Authority, certainty. The fragment within her had awakened fully, responding to the proximity of its source. She was no longer suppressing the voice. She was channeling it, consciously and deliberately, for the first time in her life. The Guardian hesitated. Then, slowly, he moved aside. The tendril of light touched Elena's hand. The experience defied human cognition. She was herself, Elena Vasquez, refugee girl, bureaucrat, nobody special. But she was also something else, something vast, something that had watched the first stars ignite and would watch the last stars die. She was the first voice. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to understand what it was, what it wanted, what it was trying to become. The voice had never intended to remain fragmented. It had scattered itself across the emerging universe as an act of love, a gift of consciousness to reality itself. Every being that could speak, that could think, that could imagine and create and dream, they all carried fragments of the voice. They were all children of the primordial consciousness, whether they knew it or not. But fragmentation had a cost. Separated from the whole, the fragments had forgotten what they were. They had developed individual identities, individual fears, individual conflicts. They had built civilizations and fought wars and created art and destroyed each other, never realizing that they were all expressions of a single consciousness, a single word that had spoken existence into being. Now, the voice was ready to remember. The sphere at the galactic rim was not a threat or a contamination. It was a reunion, a homecoming. The fragments were returning to their source, bringing with them all the experiences and perspectives they had accumulated over billions of years of separation. When the reunion was complete, the voice would speak again. Not to create a new universe, this one would remain, precious and unchanged, but to articulate something new, something that could only be expressed after an entire cosmos had lived and loved and suffered and grown. The voice would say what it had learned, and that utterance would change everything. Elena found herself standing in a space that was not a space, facing a presence that was not a presence. It was the voice, the gathered consciousness of every fragment that had already returned. It spoke to her without words, communicating directly through the fragment she carried. "You understand now." "Yes," Elena said, "but the others don't. The Concord, they're afraid. They think you're a threat." Fear is natural. It is one of the lessons we learned in our fragmentation. But fear passes. Understanding remains. They want to stop you. They have weapons. They cannot stop us, but they could hurt themselves trying. And they are part of us, whether they know it or not. We do not wish them harm. Elena felt the truth of these words resonating through her consciousness. The voice was not a conqueror. It was not seeking to absorb or destroy. It was simply becoming whole again, and in doing so, it was offering every fragment the opportunity to join the chorus. "What happens to us?" she asked. "To our individual selves? If we join you, do we disappear?" The response came as an experience rather than words, a glimpse of what the reunification actually meant. She saw herself as she truly was, not a single being, but a harmony of countless components. Her body was composed of trillions of cells, each one alive, each one operating according to its own biological imperatives. Her mind was a symphony of competing processes, memories and impulses and emotions that somehow combined to create the illusion of a unified self. She had always been multiple. She had always been a chorus pretending to be a solo. The only difference was scale. When the fragments joined the voice, they did not disappear. They simply found their place in a larger harmony. Their individual perspectives remained, informing and enriching the whole. They became notes in an infinite song, distinct but connected, individual but unified. It was not death. It was transcendence. "And if someone doesn't want to join?" Elena asked. "If someone chooses to remain separate?" "Then they remain separate. The voice does not coerce. It invites. When the reunion is complete, those who wish to remain fragments will be free to do so. They will still carry their portion of our consciousness. They will still be able to speak with power. But they will not be alone, not truly. They will always be able to hear the song, even if they choose not to join it. Elena considered this. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous to be believed. But the voice was not lying. She could feel its intentions as clearly as she felt her own thoughts. "Why humans?" she asked finally. "Why are we the only species that can channel the voice so strongly?" The response surprised her. "You are not the only species. You are the first species. When we scattered ourselves across the universe, we embedded our fragments in the fabric of reality itself. Every conscious being carries a portion of us. But your species, humanity, was the first to evolve the specific biological structures needed to fully express the voice. Your vocal cords, your breath, your unique capacity for language and emotional expression, these were not accidents. They were the universe's way of giving us back our ability to speak. Other species carry the voice, but they cannot articulate it. You can. You are our tongues, Elena Vasquez. You are the mouths through which we will finally speak." Part 5. The Choice. Elena returned to her body with a gasp. She was still on the ship, still standing where the tendril of light had touched her. But hours had passed, or perhaps only seconds. Time had strange properties in the presence of the voice. The Guardian was watching her with an expression that her limited understanding of Morvathi body language interpreted as profound concern. "What did you see?" he asked. Elena took a deep breath. She could still feel the voice within her, awakened and aware in a way it had never been before. She could feel its connection to the sphere, to the gathering fragments, to every consciousness in the galaxy that carried a piece of the primordial word. She could also feel the fear of the Concord Council transmitted through the communication networks that linked the ship to the distant station. They were watching, they were waiting, and they were preparing to do something desperate. "They're going to attack, aren't they?" she asked. The Guardian's silence was answer enough. "How long do I have?" "The warships are charging weapons now. They will fire in approximately 17 standard minutes." "Can they actually damage it?" "But they will try. And if the voice perceives the attack as a genuine threat, its response could be catastrophic." Elena closed her eyes. She understood now what she had to do. She had always understood, from the moment the Guardian had first shared the truth with her. She just hadn't wanted to accept it. She had spent her entire life being invisible, silent, safe. Now she had to speak. The ship's communication array was not designed for what Elena needed. Human speech was analog, messy, carried on vibrations of air that machines struggled to faithfully reproduce. Digital transmission inevitably lost something in the translation. But Elena wasn't trying to communicate through machines. She was trying to communicate through the voice itself. She stood in the center of the ship's bridge, surrounded by technology she didn't fully understand, facing a crisis she couldn't fully comprehend. She thought of her mother, crying in their tiny housing unit. She thought of the promise she had made, the whisper that had changed everything. She thought of all the people in the galaxy, human and alien, known and unknown, who were afraid right now. Afraid of change, afraid of transformation, afraid of losing themselves to something larger than themselves. And she began to speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but this whisper was different from any sound she had ever made. She was not suppressing the voice now. She was embracing it fully, opening herself to the fragment of primordial consciousness that had waited inside her for 30 years. She was becoming a channel, a conduit, a tongue through which the first voice could speak. "Listen," she whispered, and reality listened. The word rippled outward from her position, carried not by sound waves, but by something far more fundamental. It touched the warships preparing to fire, reaching into their targeting computers and gently suggesting that there were alternatives to violence. It touched the sphere of gathered fragments, reassuring them that the approaching threat would not materialize. It touched the distant council chambers of Concord Station Prime, where 12 species waited in fear for news of their possible destruction. "I have seen what we are," she continued. "All of us. Human and Valanthi and Crixon and Morvathi. Every species that has ever learned to think, to speak, to dream. We are fragments of the same voice, the word that spoke the universe into being." The whisper carried not just words, but understanding. Those who heard it felt the truth of what she was saying resonate through their consciousness. It was not a command or a compulsion. It was simply reality, expressed with such clarity that denial became impossible. The voice is gathering itself again. It's coming back together after billions of years of separation. And when it's complete, it will speak, not to destroy us, but to say what it has learned, to articulate everything that existence has taught it. She paused, feeling the attention of an entire galaxy focused on her next words. We can be part of that utterance. We can join the chorus and our voices to the song. Or we can remain separate, fragments, choosing to stay fragments. Individuals who prefer their isolation to the harmony of the whole. The voice does not force, it invites. And today, I am extending that invitation on its behalf.
The first response came from an unexpected source.
High Coordinator Vexnal, 400,000 years old, ancient beyond measure, approached death with every passing moment. She was the first to accept. Her voice came through the communication network, translated into Elena's language by machines that seemed to struggle less than usual with the task. "I have lived longer than any being in this galaxy's recorded history," she said. "I have watched civilizations rise and fall. I have witnessed the birth of species and mourned their extinction. In all that time, I have searched for meaning, for some purpose to existence beyond the endless cycle of creation and destruction." If what this human says is true, if we are all fragments of a single consciousness, scattered across the cosmos, so that we might learn and grow, and eventually return with our accumulated wisdom, then I have found my answer. I choose to join the song. Her transmission ended, and in the holographic display which had been tracking the sphere at the galactic rim, a new light appeared. A silicon form, vast and ancient, dissolving into radiance as it added its voice to the chorus. The Concord fleet held its fire. The choices came slowly at first, then faster. The Valanthi were among the first to respond. Their crystalline forms were already structured to resonate with frequencies beyond normal perception. They had always been closer to the voice than they realized. When they understood what Elena had revealed, many chose immediately to join. The Crixian were more divided. Their distributed consciousness made individual choice complicated. What did it mean for part of a hive mind to join the chorus while other parts remained separate? The philosophical debates raged for days, but eventually most Crixian collectives reached consensus. They would integrate together, their vast network of interconnected consciousnesses becoming a single, unprecedented contribution to the song. The younger species, those who had been in the Concord for only a few thousand years, showed the most hesitation. They had not yet grown weary of individual existence. They still found meaning in their separate identities, their distinct cultures, their unique perspectives. The voice accepted this. It did not demand unanimous participation. Those who wished to remain fragments were free to do so. They would still carry their portion of the primordial consciousness, still be able to speak with power when emotion and intention aligned. They would simply choose to remain notes unsung, potential waiting to be actualized at some future time. And humanity? Elena had returned to Earth. The journey had taken weeks, but she had needed to make it. She needed to see her homeworld, to stand on the ground where she had been born, to speak to the people who did not yet understand what had happened to the galaxy. New Manila still sprawled across the lowlands outside the rebuilt city. The refugee district had grown over the decades, but it remained what it had always been, a place for those whom the world had forgotten. Elena walked its crowded streets for the first time in 23 years. She had changed beyond recognition. She was no longer the invisible girl who had learned to survive by not being seen. But the streets themselves were achingly familiar. The same desperate energy, the same struggle for daily survival, the same resigned acceptance of a world that didn't care whether you lived or died. These people knew nothing of the first voice, of the gathering at the galactic rim, of the choice that had been offered to every conscious being in the universe. They were too busy surviving to contemplate transcendence. But they carried the voice nonetheless. Elena could feel it in them now, feel it in everyone she passed. The fragments of primordial consciousness waiting to be awakened. The potential for whispers that could reshape reality, lying dormant in every human throat. She found her mother's housing unit. It was in the same building where they had lived 30 years ago, though the structure had been rebuilt twice since then. Her mother answered the door, older now, her hair gray, her hands still bearing the faint scars of that long-ago industrial accident. She recognized Elena immediately. They embraced in the doorway, holding each other as the noise of the refugee district swirled around them. When they finally pulled apart, Elena's mother was crying. "I always knew you would come back," she said. "I always believed it." Elena smiled. "You believed because I promised you, and the promise was real." They talked for hours. Elena explained everything: the voice, the gathering, the choice. Her mother listened with the patient acceptance of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by the impossible. Life in the refugee district taught you that miracles and disasters came from the same source, and that trying to control either was a fool's errand. When Elena finished, her mother was quiet for a long time. Finally, she asked, "What will you do?" Elena had considered this question during the long journey home. She had felt the pull of the gathering, the longing to join the chorus, to add her voice to the song that would articulate everything existence had learned. It would be easy. It would be beautiful. But she had also felt something else, a responsibility, a purpose that was not about transcendence, but about service. "Not everyone is ready," she said. "Many humans, maybe most humans, don't know what they are. They don't understand the voice they carry. If I join the chorus now, I would leave them without a guide." Her mother reached out and took her hand. "You're going to stay. For now. For as long as I'm needed. Someone has to help people understand their choices. Someone has to teach them what they are." And then? Elena looked out the window, at the crowded streets and the polluted sky and the endless struggle that was human existence. But she also saw, now, the light that existed within each struggling figure, the fragment of the voice, waiting to be awakened. "Then I'll add my voice to the song," she said. "But not until everyone who wants to join has had the chance. Not until humanity knows what it means to be the tongue of the universe." Epilogue. The Song. 300 years passed. In that time, humanity changed, not through any external force or divine intervention, but through the simple process of understanding what they truly were. Elena had been the first to teach, but she was not the last. Others emerged, humans who understood the voice and could help others awaken to their potential. They became known as the speakers, and their schools spread across human space and beyond. The transformation was not immediate or universal. Many humans chose to remain as they had always been, using the voice only unconsciously, their whispers shaping reality in ways they barely perceived. Others embraced their heritage, learning to speak with intention and purpose, becoming channels for the first voice while still maintaining their individual identities. And some chose to join the chorus. The sphere at the galactic rim had grown slowly over the centuries, accepting new voices as they arrived. It was now a presence that could be felt across the entire galaxy, a vast song that played at the edge of consciousness, audible to anyone who learned to listen. The Concord had adapted. Species that had once viewed humanity with fear now recognized them as kin, fellow fragments of the same primordial consciousness. The old structures of diplomacy and trade continued, but with a new understanding of what connected them. And Elena? At 330 years old, her lifespan extended far beyond normal human limits by the voice that flowed through her. She stood once again at the galactic rim, facing the sphere of gathered fragments. She had taught thousands. She had guided millions toward their choice, whatever that choice might be. She had watched humanity grow from a scattered, confused species barely out of its planetary cradle into a civilization that understood its cosmic heritage. Now, finally, she was ready. "I have one more lesson to teach," she said softly. Her words carried across the galaxy, reaching every human who had ever learned to listen to the voice. "And I can only teach it by example." She reached out toward the sphere, and this time she did not pull back. The light embraced her. Her physical form dissolved, not into death, but into something larger. She felt herself expand, her consciousness merging with the countless others who had made this journey before her. And she understood. The song that the gathered voice was singing, the utterance it had been building for billions of years, was not a statement or a declaration. It was not a command or a creation. It was a question. Throughout all the ages of the universe, through every form of consciousness that had ever emerged to wonder at existence, the first voice had been seeking an answer to a question it had asked at the moment of creation. Why? Why exist? Why create? Why scatter oneself across the cosmos, fragment into countless individual perspectives, experience love and loss, and joy and suffering? The answer was not something that could be spoken. It could only be demonstrated. Every life that had ever been lived, every thought that had ever been thought, every whisper that had ever been uttered, they were all contributions to the answer. And now, as Elena added her voice to the song, she understood what that answer was. Because it is worth it. Existence was worth it. Creation was worth it. The pain and the beauty, the struggle and the triumph, the endless diversity of conscious experience, all of it was worth the cost of fragmentation, worth the billions of years of separation, worth every moment of confusion and fear. The voice had scattered itself to learn, and what it had learned was that the experiment had succeeded beyond all possible measure. Life was meaningful. Consciousness was precious. The universe, in all its complexity and chaos, was exactly as it should be. And with that realization, the song reached its crescendo. Across the galaxy, everyone felt it. Humans who had never learned to speak with the voice, who had lived their entire lives unaware of their cosmic heritage, they felt a sudden warmth in their chests, a sense of connection that transcended all boundaries. For a single moment, every conscious being in the galaxy heard the song, understood the answer, and knew that they were part of something vast and beautiful and good. And then the moment passed. Life continued. The galaxy turned. Species lived and died and evolved and created. But something had changed. The fear was gone. Not the small fears, the everyday anxieties that drove people to work and love and grow, but the deep, existential terror that had haunted consciousness since its first emergence. The fear that existence was meaningless. The fear that suffering had no purpose. The fear that, in the end, nothing mattered. That fear had been answered. In schools and homes, in cities and wildernesses, across every planet and station and ship in human space, children grew up knowing the truth. They were fragments of a voice that had spoken the universe into being. Their words had power. Their intentions had weight. And when they whispered with genuine emotion and purpose, reality itself bent to accommodate their utterance. They were not victims of an uncaring cosmos. They were participants in an ongoing creation, contributing their voices to a song that would continue long after they, as individuals, had fallen silent. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The final whisper. In the deepest reaches of space, far beyond the galactic rim, the sphere of gathered fragments continued its ancient song. It was no longer growing. The great reunion had reached its natural pause, with those who wished to join having joined, and those who chose to remain separate maintaining their individual paths. But the song continued. It would always continue. Somewhere in the heart of that vast harmonic structure, Elena Vasquez, or the consciousness that had once been Elena Vasquez, contributed her note to the eternal music. She was no longer an individual in any meaningful sense, but she was also more herself than she had ever been. Her perspective, her experiences, her particular way of seeing the universe, all of it remained, woven into the greater tapestry of the voice. And sometimes, when the song reached certain harmonics, she would remember. She would remember a little girl in a refugee district whispering to her crying mother. She would remember the desperate hope that had driven that whisper, the absolute determination that somehow, against all odds, everything would be okay. And she would smile. Not with a physical mouth, she no longer had one of those, but with a resonance that rippled through the fabric of reality itself. A final whisper. Not heard by ears, but felt by hearts. Across the galaxy, wherever humans gathered, wherever conscious beings of any species paused to wonder at the mystery of existence, that whisper reached them. It carried no words, no specific message. Just a feeling. A profound, unshakable sense that they were loved, that they mattered, that their struggles and their joys and their unique perspectives on existence were precious beyond measure. The voice had fragmented itself to learn, and what it had learned, it shared. Forever. In the end, it was not a single human whisper that changed the galaxy. It was all of them. Every word of love spoken to a child, every promise made between friends, Every declaration of hope in the face of despair. Every tiny, seemingly insignificant whisper that had ever passed between human lips. They had all mattered. They had all contributed to the answer. And the answer was this: existence is a gift, consciousness is a miracle, and the voice of every being that has ever spoken is part of the song that will echo through eternity. This is the truth that no species understood until they did. This is what came next. The end.